tired of this. And I use the analogy of a crack house, right? If you have a neighborhood, right, you know, and when I was in Chicago, I promise you, we had these, where you have these drug dens, right? And you look at it and you say, well, wow, that person who's running the drug den sure seems to be making a lot of money, right? Sure. But you look and say that's going to end up one of two ways. You're either going to be arrested or dead by the time you're 25 if you are running drugs and playing in that kind of aspect, or addicted, right? Your response to that drug, if it's in your neighborhood, your response to that crack house is to do one of two things. Either go and knock on the door, right? Hi, I really don't like the fact you're selling crack, and you know, to in essence put your values on someone else, or to sit there, and this is what George Kennan's argument is, and to contain them, and to say in essence, what you're doing is going to end up negatively for you. You're going to be dead in jail or an addict, right? You don't have to believe me, but this is what I believe, right? And as long as you don't try and sell your drugs to my kids, as long as you don't bother my neighbors, as long as you don't do things that are outside of your realm of influence, go ahead, right? Off you go, right? Very similar to my policy of attendance for class. You don't want to attend class? Don't attend class. That is your decision. I am not here to change your life. And the United States needs to remain, and this is the key for Kennan's long telegram, patient and firm. And to say, in essence, we believe in democracy, we believe in industrial capitalism, or capitalism as an economic system. And we're not going to challenge, we're not going to say you're doing it wrong. What we're going to say is we're not going to allow you to prey on our friends and allies in the region. Okay? So when Kennan's policy, and eventually they're going to, maybe 500 people are aware of this, right, when it's first announced. He's going to write a letter, an article that's going to be published in a journal called Foreign Affairs, which you can read, under the title of Mr. X. I always wanted to pump something in Mr. X, right? So he didn't even give his name. That kind of spells out the basic ideas here. But Kennan talks about here's who Russia is, and in his own language, the ideology of communism, right? He goes, Marxism. This is why Soviet proposals must always be solely clothed in the trappings of Marxism, and why no one should underestimate the importance of dogma to Soviet affairs. But it is a fig leaf. It's a fig leaf of their moral and intellectual respectability. Meaning what? They don't care about making the world a communist state. They don't care about ideologically. They care about disrupting the West. They care about messing with our elections. They care about undermining the institutions of the United States. That has not changed. Kennan's view is still prevalent today. If there's one foreign policy approach I would take, it would be Kennan's. Lock it up, say, hey, listen, you do what you want, the Soviet Union or People's Republic or whatever. We don't think it's going to end well. And in 1989, that was proved to be true for the Soviet Union. It collapsed of its own weakness. In response to this, Truman is looking for a policy. Truman agrees that this is the best way to approach it, to contain communism, to say in essence, here it is in this country, just fine and dandy. Support economic, how is he going to change? Here's where you see the policies of the United States begin to change. So where does it come from? It comes from those pressure points I talked about before. What does the United States do? It adapts this policy of containment. When we get to Vietnam, this is no longer going to be the policy, so I'll get to that in just a second. So in 1946, you've got this, hey, this is how we're going to approach. They do two things, right? Number one, they recognize that we are an economic superpower in 1945 and in 2022. Right? Again, pull up Wikipedia if you don't believe me. Our economy is so much larger, the wealth of this country is so much larger than any other country on the planet, that in essence, to be patient and firm means we're going to take a portion of our money and spend it to help others compete against us, to be good consumers, right? To be good industrial capitalists. It's like a parent. I mean, again, I know these are independent countries, you don't have parent-child kind of relationship. But, when you're growing up, your mom and dad are going to say, hey, listen, here's what I'm going to do to try and help you to behave and to act in a certain way that is similar to what I have lived in my life, and these are values that we assume. To put a less glossy term on it, you're going to go to work, and a portion of your salary is going to be taken and redistributed to these foreign countries, right? So why are we doing that? We're, in essence, building up the rest of the world's economy. Here's globalization. Using the American economy, and I love this image, right? You know, the American taxpayer in Europe, right? It starts with the Truman plan, or Truman Doctrine initially, 400 million. These numbers look pale by comparison, but it was back when $1 million was really real money, right? So, you know, now we're in a different world. The Marshall Plan is probably the biggest of these. And what it lays out, and it was open to the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union could have done this. But it says, if you're going to take money from us, if you're going to take money from the United States, here's what you gotta do. There has to be cost accounting. You have to know where it's being spent. There has to be some sense of, here's the project that we're trying to accomplish. There's an old phrase that the person who pays the piper names the tune. The person who puts the quarter in the jukebox gets to push the button as to what song is going to be played, right? The United States is saying, we're going to provide you this money, but you're going to use it in ways that we approve. Building infrastructure, helping training workers, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to, the United States creates institutions, and again, you've seen these during World War II. International Monetary Fund, UN Relief, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. All gobbledygook to most people, including myself. What are they doing? They're establishing the rules by which the United States is willing to be an economic partner. You play by those rules. You don't dump steel in the United States economy like China has. You don't build up tariffs and barriers, et cetera, like other countries have, like our country did recently. You play by an open economy rules, and we will trade with you. Open freely, may the best competitor win. Right? No, by the way, historically that best competitor has been this country, right? Or at least, you know, we're a medalist, let's put it that way. Right? When you look at the amount of money, and I'll come back to Wikipedia in just a second, this is 2013, this is a good graphic. Most of that money is going to be, in essence, it's less than 1% of all the money that's going to be brought in by taxes. Most of that money is going to cycle right back into the American economy. A third of it is going to be used for military spending. So in essence, we're either donating or giving away military goods, planes, boats, guns, et cetera, anti-tank missiles, et cetera, which are built in this country anyway. And so in essence, it's a works job, or a works project, right? But you can see in terms of a percentage of the American budget, now this is 2013, again, the magic Wikipedia in the sky, US foreign aid. These are the countries that we've been spending it on. Again, Afghanistan, ugly exit. Do you really want to be spending $4 billion of your taxpayer dollars every year on a country like this, right? Notice here, I was looking this morning, Ukraine, this was in 2020, this Ukraine number is going to go up, I promise you that, right? But if you look at how they divide it, economic assistance and military assistance, for most of these, the military assistance is massive. Israel, perfect example, $3.3 billion every year is going to that country to help sustain its military presence. So the first part of the containment policy, the first part of the containment policy is using the fact that we are the richest country on the planet to entice others to play by the rules that we establish. Here's what we want to see. We want to see democracies. We want to see elections. We want to see constitutions. We want to see protections for civil liberties. But we also want to see people who are competing, building cars, building steel, all that kind of stuff, and competing with American industry on those marketplaces. So one component of the Cold War and the following from Truman's or from containment is that you want to play by our rules? Great, we'll help you do it. As I mentioned, we offered the same deal to the Soviet Union. They refused to take the money. Why? Because we told them, here's how you got to account for it. We're not just going to give you gold bars and let you wander off, right? Here's what you got to do with it. And you got to tell us what's going on with the money, right? The second aspect of this, patient and firm, is to extend America's military might across the world, right? To say, in essence, we represent liberal democracy, we represent free market capitalism, again, all air quotes, I understand. We're willing to protect others who are doing the same. Even if you're right up against a hostile country, even if you have all kinds of economic problems, we're willing to help you get to that point and not have to worry about spending money on your own defense. For 30 years, the Japanese military budget was zero. Imagine if we were in that situation. We didn't spend a penny on our military. Right? Boy, that would be a lot of money, right? As we're going to see in just a second. We are going to first and foremost going to form joint defense pacts. NATO, NATO, everyone's pretty familiar, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. SATO is Southeast Asia. Treaty Organization. There's the Organization of American States for Central and South America. There are the non-aligned countries, right? There's a host of these that are going to be constructed over the next few years. And what they're saying to places like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam eventually, is that you do not need to spend an inordinate amount of your own money developing your military. We got your back. And by and large, it works. Right? Again, you can see the value of NATO in our current scenario. And again, I have to say this, the assumption was, and the statement was, the previous administration was going to withdraw this country from NATO. Right? That was the plan. So again, not saying it's a good or bad idea. I'm saying is that I don't think that was part of the assumption of this is what a vote means for one person or another. The other part of it is a little slipperier because this concept of national security had never really been part of the American conversation. Our Constitution allows for criticism. The First Amendment says the federal government can't prohibit your right to say things, right? There are certain aspects where that, you can't yell fire in a crowded room, but for the most part, you have the right to criticize the government in regards to that. National security starts to lay over this a sense of saying, well, what you're doing is supporting our enemy, and that is ultimately harmful for the United States. Well, there is no clause of that in the Constitution, right? Democracy is hard. Constitutional aspects are hard. And what you see is the development following World War II of these national security apparatus. There already is the CIA from what's called the OSS in World War II. We've already had an FBI, which is an internal domestic political force. But you start to see the organization, the JCS is Joint Chiefs of Staff. The big one is the National Security Council. NSC is created to, in essence, use kind of technological means by which to keep an eye on potential enemies to the United States, both foreign and domestic. Yeah.
You said the FBI was a domestic political force? Is that
No,
what you
police
just said
force,
that?
I'm sorry. I might have, if I did, it was incorrect. It's a police force. It's a domestic police force, sorry, yeah. So NSC is the new one, and NSC is going to be focusing more on electronic communications, spy satellites, reading your email as they did under the Patriot Act, tracking your phones and those and whatnot. These are secret organizations that are funded, in essence, outside the normal purview of the American budgeting process. And again, when you look at this commitment, the United States is providing 1% of every tax dollar for the rest of the world. Again, Wikipedia, gonna help military expenditures. When you look at the American, these are in billions, by the way, right? Almost $1 trillion, this is in 2022, estimated 3 times what the People's Republic. I mean, the numbers that we are spending on military spending are astronomical, right? And we're doing this in large part because of the argument that says we are going to serve as the backstop so that we don't have World War II again. So that anyone like a Hitler is going to say, whoa, I know exactly what the United States is going to do if we invade Poland. I know exactly what the United States is going to do if we invade Japan, because we're treaty aligned to them. This is going to place a significant economic, it still does, but it is going to place a significant economic burden on the United States. This is without a war. Right? When wars come, and you'll see some examples of that in just a second, that number is going to spike. So when talking about containment, how do we contain? We contain by basically a carrot and a stick. The carrot being play by our rules, develop your economy so that it cooperates and works within the world economy, the American kind of economic system, and we will help you do that. We will stabilize it. We'll let you use our dollars as the stabilizing currency. But at the same time, we will promise our allies that you do not have to fear the scenario that existed at the start of World War II, which was everybody is off on their own. Czechoslovakia gets picked off, and then, et cetera, et cetera. That this is the process of, in essence, containing the expansion of the Soviet Union. Okay? World events do not, these are the numbers. You can look at this one of 2 ways. These are the raw expenditures. These are as a percentage of GDP. So as we get wealthier, the percentage of expenses is going to start to decline, right? But, you know, what you're looking at here is the Iraq War. You're gonna look here at the military buildup in Vietnam. Right? These are like running a marathon with putting a 25 weight in your backpack. And when, it's not a problem in 1945, because Germany is smoldering, Japan is radioactive, most of our competitors are still reeling from the cost of World War II. By the time you get to the 60s and 70s, these economies are coming back online with the most modern economic kind of development. They're much more mechanized, much more efficient, right? And ours are sort of these old stodgy, we're gonna just do it the way we've always done it because things never change. The United States is gonna run into a problem, as we're gonna see in this decade of the 60s and 70s. Vietnam is a key component of that, right? So you can see where the issues are kind of coming from. But containment is not going and stepping in and saying, we're gonna go in and change Iraq. We're gonna go in and change, you know, Afghanistan. We're gonna go in and nation build these countries. And that is exactly what we end up doing in a place like Vietnam, is to say to the Vietnamese, we will tell you what kind of government you should have. That is problematic, that's different, right? So containment is this policy that the Truman administration kicks off, and it's generally kind of understood as a backbone of American foreign policy, but contemporary events do not wait. The Soviet Union, no one is more shocked than the Soviet Union by the Americans' reaction. Historically, we have taken our toys and gone home. We don't do this after World War II. After World War II, we say, no, we are going to have an international presence. No one was more shocked than Joseph Stalin and the Soviets. Wow, you know, the Americans are here to stay. What you'll see is that they, in essence, do the exact same thing that the Americans do in response, right? Is that they, in essence, create their own joint alliance amongst the occupied countries that they control, Warsaw Pact, and create their own economic planning institution, much like the IMF and the World Bank. So they're going to follow in kind, right? And yet you see this pressure being placed globally on countries like India and Southeast Asia and colonies in Africa and elsewhere. What side are you going to go? Who are you going to get your money from? Right? We're going to help you build, you know, dams and roads and electricity grids and all the rest of that stuff. Or are you going to go with the Soviet Union? Right? This containment policy is not given a chance to really expand because two events are going to shock American foreign policy experts. The first, as I mentioned, well, the first is down here, is that the Soviets are able to detonate their own nuclear device. Again, it is not hard, right? It's all relative, right? I couldn't build one, but it is not hard to physically or even engineering-wise construct a nuclear device. There was no monopoly to it, and the Soviets were capable of doing what? Of enriching uranium and turning this into a weaponized format. This is the country that's going to be the first one in space too, right? So they're capable of using technology to their advantage. This is going to send shockwaves. We no longer have a nuclear monopoly. By 1957, as I mentioned, they have a space program, so you could be dropping these things down from outer space. It's going to cause a shock. The bigger shock is going to be in 1949 when the Chinese Revolution, which has been going on for almost 75 years, is finally going to be resolved in favor of the People's Republic. So the People's Republic of China is formed. Our ally in World War II, National China, is going to relocate to Taiwan. And so if you hear conversations about the PRC, People's Republic, in Taiwan, there's still an unresolved issue that's going on based on this 1949. Both of these seem to suggest that the communist side is getting stronger, right? In sheer landmass. Right? You can look at it, sheer population. You're looking at large numbers of the world suddenly saying, we ain't playing by America's rules. Both ideological leaders, both the Soviet Union and the United States, seems as if the United States is losing that battle. And it's here where the National Security Council, again, this is a new administration, this is the Truman administration, the National Security Council is going to say, okay, we have this containment policy, what are we going to do in response to these two new shocks? And what they come up with is something called NSC 68. So NSC 68 is the National Security Council, NSC, right, is going to respond to the politicians. And so the president says, I want to have you write a report on what the current situation. And they do this repeatedly, they're called white papers, right? And the 68th one that they released in 1950 is simply called NSC 68. So it could have been NSC 62 or whatever, NSC 12, doesn't matter. About 500 people total in the United States, and probably globally, had read this document in its first 5 years. Maybe, right? It is a super secret document. It is saying, in essence, here are our assumptions moving forward. And they are wholly different than what containment is going to argue. By the way, you can Google it now and get the whole, you can basically read it text for text, right? What is George Kennan argument? George Kennan argument is that communism, and by extension the Soviet Union, is like a crack house. They are going to fall by their own wrong decisions. And we need to be confident in our own decisions. No, I'm gonna get a job. No, I'm gonna buy a house and invest in the stock market. No, I'm gonna save money. I'm gonna keep myself, that kind of stuff. Kennan is saying, be confident, America, in who you are. What NSC 68 does is flip that on its head. And to say, in essence, we have this bogeyman out there called communism. We've got to go search and destroy. We've got to go into these countries and go find it. We got to go tell them what to do. We got to go knock on that crack house door, right? And say, we're living our life a certain way, and it really is leading to, we have to, in essence, get into nation change. It assumes a worst case scenario, where Kennan is arguing that you see in Russia, in the war years and even going back further, a level of anti-Westernism and paranoia, maybe justified, that is going to be working against them. NSC 68 ignores that and says, what we're looking at here is a global question of whose allegiance people are going to have ideologically, right? I don't know what your ideology is, and quite honestly, I don't care. My job is not to say, in essence, here's your ideological view. My job is to say, here's the evidence, right? Here's the material that you can get from history, right? That's what containment is saying, here's the options you're facing. NSC 68 suggests, in essence, that the Soviet Union is willing to do anything to turn the entire world, and by extension the People's Republic, to turn the entire world into a communist paradise or whatever. Right? The way in which the United States responds to this, according to NSC, is to create, in essence, what Eisenhower is later going to call a military-industrial complex. Ford Motor Company and Kaiser Permanente and all these other companies, they don't normally build military hardware. And the only reason that they did during the war was because we were at war. What NSC 68 says is that we need to double down on the size of our military. We need to spend money. We need to, in essence, begin to make people very, very wealthy in the defense industries. And those wealthy people are going to do what? They are going to help elect politicians who are going to make sure that they are also going to be protected. It creates, in essence, this very socialistic, right? If you're conservative and you're worried about socialism, here's the perfect example of it, right? There's no competition, there's no free bids, there's just simply money, right? To say, in essence, the United States is going to spend it. The ideological assumption is that enemies are everywhere, and that we have to approach this from a standpoint of enemies first. And I always use, again, by analogy, so here's the language, right? Evolving the issue fulfills this, fulfillment or destruction of only this republic, but civilization itself. You don't want to have a foreign policy that's geared towards, we're going to save civilization. Why am I sending your brother to a combat zone, to save civil? No. How about taking a bridge? How about taking a commander out? How about looting their ability to use tanks, right? Those are operational. Saving civilization is not. Without the superior aggregate military strength and being readily mobilizable, a policy of containment, which is an effective policy of calculated coercion, is no more than policy of blood. So what they're saying here is that Kennan is bluffing, right? That our confidence in our own ability to lead by example is absurd, right? It's not something that we believe in ourselves. We need to actively go out and seek opposition and push back wherever it exists. Yeah.
This Kennan, who was he aligned with? Who was he?
That's a great question. He was the State Department, right? So he, he's an American citizen. He's working in Moscow with the State Department. And so the State Department is what? State Department are diplomats and embassies and interacting on a very personal level. And Kennan is talking with a bunch of people. NSC 68 are a bunch of, you know, for lack of a better, academics sitting in a quiet room.
But his allegiance was to us.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, no, Kennan's, he's long-lived too, so he's writing for another 50 years, yeah, but he's an American, right? And I would argue his policies are more sensible, right, whatever, that's an editorial statement on my part, right? The problems with this are numerous, right? You gotta remember, you have a country in the United States which is not used to involving itself around the globe. The reason we finally got involved in World War II is that Pearl Harbor was bombed. Right? So we're not inherently desirous of involving ourselves, but in essence what we're saying is that every battle around the planet, the reason why the Indians are becoming independent, the reason why the Pakistanis are becoming independent, the reason why, you know, I go down the list, the Vietnamese are fighting the French to maintain their independence, ultimately boils down to a question of whether you're for or against the United States. And that is not the way, you know, when we get to US in the Middle East, Iraq is a really weird country because it has multiple religious representations. Most countries in the region do not. We never even looked at that, right? Our president at the time was surprised there's something called Shia and Sunni Muslims, right? And they hate each other, just like back in the day, Catholics and Protestants hated each other. Major battles like this very often are local and are cultural. An aspect we're going to get back to. It assumes the Soviet Union is much more powerful than it actually is. Obviously, the Soviet Union collapses. We have access to their sources. We know now that the CIA is estimating that the Soviet military capacity is almost 10 times what it actually is. Right? It does add to the threat. It does get the president to read your president daily briefing. If you're saying, in essence, wow, look at this scary bear that's over the horizon. The same thing, by the way, is being demonstrated today in Ukraine. And that what you're seeing is the initial estimates a month ago is, well, the Russians are going to go through like a knife through hot butter. They don't have clothing for the weather. They don't have food, right? Their logistics are completely shot. The assumptions that are made are very often assumptions that are worst-case scenarios. Right? So every problem around the globe is now seen through this ideological lens. Soviets have got Superman and, you know, the X-Men fighting for them and all these kinds of things. And American foreign policy is put onto what is effectively called a universal doctrine. Every problem has to go filtering through NSC 68. Again, the old adage, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. You know, if you have a screw, you can't nail it in. Right? And I always use, again, by analogy, if I had to prove, even though I know it's true, that everyone in this class, right, thought this class was the best class they ever had, they ever will have, right? If I had to prove that, I could prove it. I could force you. I could, a pop quiz, one question. Is this the best class you ever had, ever will have? It's worth 10,000 points. All right, you know, here you go. Right? I can prove it. I can force you to say that because ultimately you're going to say, man, whatever, I don't care. I'm just here for the points. Right? The same thing is true with this, is that we can get countries like Iran and Guatemala and the Philippines and elsewhere who say, oh yeah, we're all about America, but we don't have constitutional protections for our citizens. We're not distributing wealth the way a capitalist economy is going to distribute wealth. We're not participating in any of the actual things you want us to participate in. But by God, we're flying the flag, right? We're your closest ally. And the fact is the United States does have ideological enemies, but they're not at home, right? This is where you see this infection. Now, it's been around for a long time, this cultural infection of saying, in essence, un-American behavior. What is un-American behavior, right? I can define it for you. America is the Constitution. Anything that violates the Constitution is un-American behavior, right? Saying you're a communist, saying you're an atheist, saying you support the People's Republic, that's not un-American. Forming and voting for a communist party, that is not un-American. That is somebody who is exercising all the rights they have as an American. You may disagree with it. You may look at them as crackheads, right? Like George Kennan would say, go ahead, go vote for the Communist Party. Go see what it does. See what your results are going to be. Right? NSC 68 is going to say, no, we have to prevent that. We need to find who's un-American. We need to find people who are a threat to this country. Right? And the Cold War, when we get back to this, the domestic Cold War, the McCarthys of the world, the Red Baiters, the people who are going after Hollywood, are going to completely ignore those conservatives during the war who were supporting Adolf Hitler. Right? So the people who were supporting Hitler are not going to face any consequences. The ones during the war who were supporting our ally, the Soviet Union, are gonna lose their job. Go figure, right? We'll come back to the domestic Cold War later on, right? So all of these, and it's just a partial list, all of these are going to put the United States on a permanent reactionary basis. And I can this way, we don't control the world. We're the biggest and strongest country in it, right? But we don't control the activities of people around us, nor should we ever want to. It's not our role, it's not our heritage, it's not how we think of ourselves. We look and say, people can make their own history, right? We're here to be who we are, to value our values, to accentuate that. This, I mean, if you look at the time frame, I'm talking about 5 years, a blip, the historical narrative. In 5 years, the United States not only reverses its foreign policy 180 degrees, but it also begins to put it on a reactionary basis, where we're forced to respond to things that we perceive as threats to the United States. It's one of the elements we'll get to when we talk about Vietnam. How does Vietnam threaten the United States? It doesn't. And yet at the same time, it makes sense within this logic, right? The irony is that America's always been most influential when we've limited our power. When other countries say, yeah, they can nuke us to the Stone Age, but they don't, because that's not who they are, right? When you limit authority, you are demonstrating your own power. The third world, and again, that term is in developing world, non-colonial, ex-colonial, post-colonial world, becomes the battlefield. It's no longer Britain and Paris and Berlin. You know, it doesn't look like the Ukraine. It doesn't look like this kind of developed country. These are countries that are, from an American perspective, just going through their own Gilded Age, just going through their own exposure to industrialization. And how screwed up we were when we were in the 1880s and 1890s about working conditions and who got the wealth and what requirements were there to protect workers, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine in the 1870s, you have a superpower come into the United States and say, here's what you're gonna have. It's gonna affect our own local politics in a very big way. It puts hidden strains on the world economy and particularly on the United States. And so as these dollar amounts begin to increase, you have to remember that our economic competitors no longer have those costs. So England, France, Germany, Japan, elsewhere are not paying the same percentage for their own national defense, and it is being placed on the American economy. This is all going to start coming to a head in 1968 to about 1975. And it forces the Cold War to become a domestic issue. Here's the first time when you start to see, the old adage again was that foreign policy and our debates end at our shoreline. That once you go beyond our shoreline, we are united. That is not the case. And it starts in the Cold War, where you're un-American, or you're a commie sympathizer, or you're a fascist, or you're this, that, or the other thing, based on foreign policy issues where supposedly the United States should act in unison. And I'll come back to McCarthyism here. This universal containment is where I'll end. This universal doctrine of containment and NSC 68 is taking place without any public debate. So you have a population who is justifiably looking for hot cars, hot girls, and cold beer, and reconstructing their families, and they're very much trusting of the president and their elected officials and the military and people of authority not to lie to them. To say, in essence, if there's a national security issue, whatever that means, in Vietnam, we are as supportive. Once the stuff hits the fan, the American public is going to start saying, well, tell me again why my son just came home in a casket. Tell me again why we're spending so much money on this war. Tell me again what we're accomplishing with this. What are our goals? What's our exit strategy? Right? Those are going to come after the fact. Right? And you know, in keeping with the kind of section that we're talking about, is the reason why I focused on Roosevelt's efforts before World War II. The Atlantic Charter, Lend-Lease, right, in 1940 and 41. All of these are taking place before the war. This is why we fight. This is why we're going to be involved in World War II. They're bringing the American public along. That stops, right? And it works as long, you know, if you're doing that and playing poker with borrowed money, it works as long as you're winning. The minute you're not winning, and all of a sudden the bills come due. All right. Postscript, we'll just leave that because, like I said, kind of back. Questions about, be clear, we're not done yet. be clear in recognizing that what I tried to do with the Cold War was not to give a comprehensive description of all the events in Korea and elsewhere, what's going on, but rather to frame out the policy questions that are going to lead to America's kind of most, I want to say, it was pathos here, most sympathetic, most tragic war of the 20th century. Okay? So keep those two kind of connected. And we will go back to the domestic part relatively quickly. All right, what I want to do today for 5 minutes is just to get this conversation started about the Vietnam War so that Monday and Wednesday of next week I can provide the specifics of it, right? Leave that for right now. First of all, just recognize where the hell the country is, right? Because Americans, we're bad about the world. We know where Ukraine is now, right? So this area right here is colonized by the French, and so it's often called French Indochina or French Indochine, right? Vietnam is this country right here. Again, for perspective, Texas is about the size of the largest island in the Philippines. So that's about the size of Texas. If you were to fold the Vietnam, in on itself, it would be about the size of, I don't know, Texas, Oklahoma, maybe one of those other square states up there. Not a huge country, but not a small country either, right? As you can see where it's located just south of China, it has, in essence, a mountainous region, kind of a spine right here that is not heavily populated, but two river valleys, the Red River and the Mekong River, that are extremely fertile agricultural land, right? So it's there where you see the exports. One of the things that the mountains do is to provide a lot of raw materials, a lot of tungsten and steel, iron, nickel, a bunch of modern requirements in terms of, so it does have resources. But it often sees itself kind of as a country represented by a woman, like a woman carrying a long pole on her shoulders on either side of these heavy baskets. It's kind of the same thing here. When you talk North and South Vietnam, you're talking North and South kind of economic centers in terms of the country. As a result, when we start talking about the North Vietnamese are going to be our opponents, the South Vietnamese are going to be our allies, you can kind of see how culturally they are separated. They're different. They're like New York versus California, or Texas versus, I don't know, New York or whatever, something like that. So just recognize where it is. The Philippines are an independent country in 1947, but we have a military base there. Most of our military is going to, particularly the air support, is all going to come from Philippine attacks, not in country. Most of the troops that are going to eventually go to Vietnam, obviously, are in country, are either going to be Marines or Army. Right? So the Air Force tends to be removed, and the Navy tends to be removed because it's not the same as World War II, where you have to have these kind of major ground advances. Right? Vietnam today, if you Google Vietnam today, what you're looking at here is a country that looks pretty prosperous. I mean, by any designation, it is pretty prosperous. It is a communist country. But if you look at what it has gone through in regards to its independence in 1975, by 2011, and that's only gotten more developed, it looks like an industrial capitalist society. Right? How many people, hey, does anyone in this room, has your life changed negatively or positively by the fact these people are living their lives and happen to define themselves as communists? And the reality is the word's no, it doesn't. There is no effect on you. There is no effect on me. There is no, other than what NSC 68 says, is that if this girl right here somehow votes for a communist, we're going to be less safe here in Corpus Christi. Right? That's what NSC 68 is arguing. There's a slippery slope that if you let something slide. A practical question by Americans is that, wait a minute, this doesn't really affect me here in Corpus Christi or in New York City or elsewhere. That's the disconnect. What's Nazi Germany, boy, I can see how it's going to affect Imperial Japan, I can see how it's affecting. The fact that these people in their own home, in their own country, are saying what their government is going to be doesn't necessarily mean a whole much to the American people who are going to come to terms with that, right? The other thing, and we'll finish here, the other thing is to recognize that much like, military history is this way, but the Vietnam War is a well-studied war. I brought in two books that I use a lot. If you're interested in Vietnam War, They March in the Sunlight is a really good book that compares one kind of locality, it just happens to be Madison, Wisconsin, of those who went to Vietnam to fight and those who stayed at home, and young people who were in college. And it does this comparison between, these are the same people, same high schools, same football teams, and are gonna have very different experiences. And Robert Bazango is a University of Houston, Rock On Cougars, right? It was down #1. But Bazango is a University of Houston professor. He's going to be writing a book basically focusing on the same thing that H.R. McMaster does, dereliction of duty. So if you're interested in Vietnam as a history, I would say the first two to start with, or one to start with, is Karnow's book. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. But Dereliction of Duty is the one that I've assigned in the past for reasons which I'll be back on Monday. If you are familiar, this is H.R. McMaster. Familiar with the name at all? You should be. He was the national security advisor for, anyone? President Lincoln? No. President Donald J. Trump. Right? He was Trump's national security advisor. And Trump basically cut him loose. But his book on the Vietnam War is required reading in the United States Marine Corps. Right? So this is something that is going to, the argument that he is going to make, which again, I'll pick up on Monday, is important. All right, have a good weekend.